Hello and welcome back to this Downfall Idealistic Crusade. In this video I wanted to go over the Humphrey Bogart related books I had in my collection on my film biographies shelf. I had more than I realized because of course I had four in addition to the main biography, and I started doing this in conjunction with the beautiful new Indicator Volume 5 of their Columbia Noir series, entirely devoted to Bogie's films at Columbia and some of his Santana Productions titles. So I really wanted to basically go back and reread the main biography, which I did, and then I started looking at the other books I had and some of the other biographies and things. So I figured I'd do a little mini review of all four of them. The first is one of these, well, it's definitely the lightest in terms of actual content, because it is basically a photo study life and work with text appreciation, simply entitled Bogie, with a foreword by his son Stephen Bogart, the main text by Richard Schickel, and then I believe it's George Perry who did the text for the actual second half entirely about the films. But the reason why I picked this up is this is one of those books that is filled with beautifully reproduced stills. It's basically a softcover coffee table book is what it is. It's nicely put together, but the stills quality is really well done. So when I found a copy of this in a used bookshop for a very cheap price, I couldn't pass it up. So the only problem is this copy does have some binding spots of wear for sure, so it's not in the best of shape, but I didn't let that discourage me because, of course, the stills were so beautifully reproduced. I don't know how well this will come across on camera, but you know, I am a sucker for this type of stuff when it's done well enough and it's inexpensive, but also it's got a lot of lesser seen stills, a lot of on-set stills and material as well, and also it's got plenty of young Bogie bits, which is not something you often see because, you know, it's always going to be the more iconic stuff. It's also got some of my favorite all-time Bogie stills, including this one, beautifully rendered in high quality on the entire page. So that's why you'd come to this book. And again, the text is pretty good, and then it goes into a section on the films for the second half of the book with stills tied directly to them. I will say, as with most books, they do focus primarily on the most famous titles, and then the others sort of get completely written off, which is unfortunate, but at least we do get a full page for Tokyo Joe. Again, the text is pretty good, and of course here's another of my favorite shots of Top Hat with no pants. So it gets across at least a good bit of his humor as well. Again, it's the most lightweight of these, but if you've ever read a coffee table book like this, you'll sort of know what you're in for, but you're coming to it primarily for the beautifully reproduced stills. Then I come to, this was actually the first Bogie book I ever bought. I bought this in a bookshop when I was a teenager looking for more Bogie information, and it's the first book of its type that I actually wound up reading. It's a lot more common now for, I think, for the children or relatives of celebrities to write books or biographies, and especially of children who only knew their parents for a certain amount of time before they unfortunately passed away, to then sort of have essentially sort of a cathartic experience writing a book that talks a little bit about themselves, but is also them learning in the way of a biographer more about the parent that they only knew for a certain amount of time. So that's why I still really enjoy Stephen Bogart's book, In Search of My Father. This was written in 1995, and again, it is the first book of its type that I had read, and it was the first Bogart book that I ever purchased for my then already growing film book library. It's still a really good read, even if you read the actual full-on biographies, but you get the more personal qualities and the reflections of how not just Bogart reflecting on his childhood in Hollywood, and of course being the son of two extremely famous parents, but also having to live with the iconic legacy of his parents and how that didn't necessarily it wasn't something that he really wanted to put up with for some time. So it took him a number of years, or actually a good chunk of his life, to sort of come to terms with that. And so that's sort of cathartic quality I mentioned in terms of when you read this book, you get that feeling, and that's the interesting part of all books of this type, when they're done right and for the right reasons. And there's a nice photo section on glossy paper halfway through, as typical of most biographies. And it is quite lengthy. It clocks in at about 300 pages and is filled with nice anecdotes too. So I still highly recommend this. There's a shot of Stephen himself on the back, and he has since done many other things in regards to his parents' legacy. Again, he did the foreword for the Bogie coffee table book. He does a lot of events and things, so you'll see him pop up. But again, I still find this a really wonderful read, and I do think it's essential for all Bogart fans. I really think there's 2 books that you should have on the shelf, and this is one of them. The other is, of course, the essential book that has been that way ever since it came out in 1997, and that is simply entitled Bogart by A.M. Sperber and Eric Lax. Sperber was writing this biography and unfortunately passed away before she could finish it, so it was Eric Lax who basically came in and helped and finished the actual biography. That's why it's credited to the pair of them. This is the essential tome on Humphrey Bogart. It clocks in at well over 600 pages, and it's so well done that it feels much shorter, in terms of it doesn't feel like a long book. It's incredibly well put together, well written, and it is the best source for the finer details of Bogart's early days, his difficult childhood with his parents, his early days as a sailor, his days in the Navy, his days as a jobbing actor on Broadway when he wasn't really getting much of anywhere, and then his first trip to Hollywood that didn't go very well, and then eventually signing the legendary contract with Warner Brothers over the Petrified Forest. It also does a great job at getting through a lot of the anecdotes. While it does tell those, it does try to get past those and get to the actual story of what happened. And when you're also talking about classic Hollywood, this is very helpful because the anecdotes get passed around so much that actually getting to the truth many years later is much more difficult, and especially when you have such larger-than-life characters involved, it's harder to get past the storytelling, even though the stories are usually more entertaining than the actualities of what happened. But it is a really well-done biography. Again, it's still, I think, the definitive book on Humphrey Bogart. There is no comparison. So if you wanted a book on Bogart, this is the one. There's also several nice photo sections on glossy paper. Of course, I couldn't resist showing the still of Bogie making himself up for the notorious Return of Dr. X, which was one of his most hated and despised roles as being a Warner contract player. Again, no other book has gone into the level of detail that this one has in really giving you a greater sense of the man behind the legend and explaining why the legend is so important, but there was actually a human being beyond the manufactured screen image, which was really an extension of most of his moral qualities, I think, and sort of an extension of his own personality. So they're not too terribly removed, which is what you always, I think, really got the sense of. But it doesn't shy away from his failings either, and it talks about his marriages, and particularly the marriage with Mayo Metho, and how the relationship with Lauren Bacall developed, and it does so in a way that's extremely easy to digest while also talking about the changing industry and the development of the industry. It goes into great detail about his involvement with the Committee for the First Amendment and their attempts to try and at least speak out against the Red Scare and the HUAC trials and how that basically imploded, unfortunately. So it does get into his political beliefs and, again, much more about the human being and not just the screen image. So it has been the Bogart book since its release. Nothing has really come along to challenge it. And if you were to have one book, or you wanted to read something about Humphrey Bogart, if you wanted to know more information, this is where you need to come. None of the other sources really go into as much detail and are as exhaustive as this is. So I think this is the book to have. It was a joy coming back to it. It was even better than how I remembered it. And like all great biographies, once you finish it, you only wish it was longer, because you were just getting used to the person. After 600 pages, you're like, I could use another 200 pages. I could use a little bit more detail here and there. Yeah. So again, the book is simply entitled Bogart by A.M. Sperber and Eric Lax. Originally released in 1997. It's gone through different printings. You can also get it as a large paperback, but it's still readily available and still the book on Bogie himself. And so this one was a first-time read for me because I'd only gotten it more recently. It's a much newer biography, and that's 2011's Tough Without a Gun, The Life and Extraordinary Afterlife of Humphrey Bogart by Stephen Canfor. Of course, the quote is a famous Raymond Chandlerism about Bogart, that he could be on screen tough without a gun. One of several absolutely spot-on perfect Chandlerisms that defined Bogart in a single sentence. This is much in the style of other biographies that Canfor has done. I have read one or two of his books, and I have another one of his, I believe, as well on my shelf. I had meant to check this out, simply because it was yet another Bogart book. It's a nicer, attractive paperback, but it is a little over 300 pages, so it's about half the length of the earlier Bogart book. And it does have some nice stills spread throughout. They aren't on glossy paper, but they are nicely printed at least. Now, I have to say that what this purports to be is a biography, and the real difference between this and the Bogart book is that this talks about the afterlife and the legacy of Bogart's films a little bit up to when it was written in 2011. And you get little sprinklings of that throughout the book, but it's mostly in the opening and then the concluding chapter or two. Those bits are fine, but they do seem rather general, like most Bogart fans would probably be aware of them. I have to say, though, reading through this, it's not very impressive. It very much feels like, I mean, I know it's covering the same information, but it is half the length of the Bogart book, and it does frequently feel like the Cliff Notes version of the Bogart book, and it's not as well written either. So to be quite honest, it's a bit more of a struggle reading this, even though it's half the length. So I do actually recommend the longer book, not just because it goes into more detail, but because it's better written, I think. And so the information is much more digestible, and it's more enjoyable to read than the shorter version. And I also felt like this glossed over too many things and didn't go into as much of the real history outside of the anecdotes. It does do that to a certain degree, and it is a good overview of Bogie's life and career. But when you have this available, I would not recommend reading this. Again, this is very much the Cliff Notes. If you wanted a much shorter version of Bogart's life and career, you could read this and at least have a good background and knowledge of his life and career, but it is the Cliff Notes version. And again, I don't think it's as well written, and I don't think the insights of today about his legacy are worth the cost of the book if you were looking for, what's the additional content? If you already have the Bogart volume, then you don't really need this. It doesn't really bring anything new to the table, I would argue, and it's very much the Cliff Notes version. So this was a disappointing read, but it's not a bad book. It's just kind of superfluous, really, because it's not really necessary when you have this great volume that is so good you wish it was even a little longer, and then you get this heavily condensed version that it's a trade paperback and it's shorter and it's cheaper, but other than that, it's really not necessary. So if you wanted a simple, shorter version of a Bogart biography, and you just wanted one book and you didn't want to do the full deep dive with the extra, double the length in terms of the biography, this would still be okay. But again, I don't think it's as well written as the previous Bogart book either. So I can't really recommend it. It's still an okay biography, but I just would not recommend this. So in short, I think you would do well to have both volumes. Have Stephen Bogart's book In Search of My Father and have the Sperber and Lax Bogart biography. These two, I think, are still the best books on the man, the myth, the legend, Humphrey Bogart, and they're still great to go back to when you decide to do your usual deep dive back into Bogart's filmography and you're finding yourself wanting to look up some more stuff. And then I just, I like myself, I just decided, what, I haven't read the biography in a long time. Let me pull it off the shelf, and I'd accumulated even more, so I wound up reading all four of them. I think these two are still the best ones. But if you were to have just one and you wanted the biography, it is still the Sperber and Lax tome. This is still the best Bogie book, and will give you all the rundowns and all the information you ever wanted to know. And it's so well written that you wish it was still going by the time you actually finished it. So here's a shot of the spines, if you were curious. So that's it for this particular video. I just wanted to do a little overview of these since I really enjoyed my time rereading the Sperber and Lax biography and Stephen Bogart's book. And I did this again because I was doing my deep dive on the Indicator box set from their Columbia Noir series. And it got me thinking about Bogie's life and career again. And again, I realized I hadn't read the main biography in so long. And then, in my used bookstore travels, I wind up accumulating all kinds of film books and biographies. So I decided I might as well read the other two again. So it's just really me going over what's on my bookshelf. But the ultimate takeaway still is that if you want a book on Humphrey Bogart, it is still the Sperber and Lax biography. So I hope this has been fun and at least somewhat informative to hear me babble on about classic films and anything related to classic films. And if I get going about Bogie, then I can go for quite some time. I hope this encourages people to check out more of Bogart's filmography and the lesser-known films, and to check out some of the books. There are a great number of books and studies about Humphrey Bogart. This is merely a small selection. These are just the ones I have on my shelf. I have read a number of other books. There are some really great vintage titles as well, but if you do decide to look for any of them, or you're looking for one book in general, it is still this one. I think this is the unchallenged one, and if you were to just get one book, I think it should be this one. So I hope that maybe hopefully encourages people to perhaps check out the Sperber and Lax biography, or any of these if you're curious. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.